Hello, everyone. A very good afternoon to all of you. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 14th JGLS Alumni webinar by distinguished alumnus Mr. Prashant Narang on the topic of an analysis of the Street Vendors Act, Potential and Limitations. I'm Shireen Moti, Assistant Professor of Law and Director of Alumni Relations at Jindal Global Law School, OP Jindal Global University. For the uninitiated, OP Jindal Global University was started in the year 2009 under the visionary leadership of our Chancellor, Mr. Naveen Jindal, and our Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. C. Rajkumar. In a span of a decade, OP Jindal Global University has been recognized as an institute of eminence by the Government of India, and Jindal Global Law School has been ranked as the #1 law school by QS World Ranking. Before I welcome our speaker for today, I would like to introduce him briefly. Mr. Prashant Narang is the Associate Director Research at the Center for Civil Society. Mr. Narang completed his LL.B degree from Campus Law Center, University of Delhi, and his LLM degree from JGLS, from where he graduated in the year 2012. He recently submitted his doctoral thesis at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His most significant contributions at the Center for Civil Society include ease of doing business reform recommendations and street vendor compliance index to track the implementation of the Street Vendors Act 2014. So he is almost an expert on the subject for today's webinar. According to Mr. Narang, municipal authorities treat more than half the street vendors as encroachers in Delhi and Mumbai. They regularly face harassment from police and other officials in their struggle to continue with their business. While the Street Vendors Act of 2014 had established some structure to help these local micro entrepreneurs, who are a big chunk of the informal economy, a lot more is still to be done. During this webinar, Mr. Narang will discuss the key highlights, advantages, the impact of the Act, and give recommendations for the better implementation of the Act. With this, I have great pleasure in welcoming our distinguished alumnus, Mr. Prashant Narang, for his opening comments. Welcome, Prashant.
Thanks, Shireen. Thanks for having me.
It's a great pleasure to have you here today to discuss about the Street Vendors Act 2014. We are not only intrigued to know the key provisions of the Act, but also your expertise and your perspective on the given Act. So before we get into the topic for the webinar today, it would be very interesting to know about your journey as a lawyer, your journey as an academic, because not only have you been working on these policy issues, but you also have had multiple other responsibilities, for example, the assistant professor at Delhi University for a brief while and working in the Supreme Court for a brief while. So it is interesting to know how you have developed yourself from a student to a successful lawyer today. And the first question that I want to ask you in this regard is, when and how did you decide to study law?
Okay. So Shireen, I actually come from a trading community family background. And I don't know any relative who has ever done law in my family or even among the distant relatives. I think I'm the first one to join legal profession. I was into my dad's business after my graduation. But after a few years, I was craving to do masters. I wasn't too sure about the stream. But I guess a friend gauged my interest. Maybe I was debating with him some social or political issue. And he insisted that I appear for the law entrance exam at the Delhi University, which I did. And to my surprise, I didn't expect, but I cleared the entrance exam. And you know, this faculty of law is the same place. Our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Rajkumar, is also an alumnus of Faculty of Law. And there are many other alumni in Jindal from the institution. So, you know, it was in the first semester when I was attending my family law classes, I realized that how interested I was in law. And same happened then in second year when I attended constitution law classes. And in third year, we had jurisprudence classes. And I wondered, you know, why I didn't really know about my interest in law. It was very surprising to me that I hadn't discovered my interest, which I then realized after getting into the field. In fact, social sciences in general, because I really didn't know that I would find social sciences so fascinating. In my school, I had opted for science stream, and you know, back those days, science was in vogue, that everybody has to, you know, if you're intelligent, you have to take science. There was peer pressure.
Same situation with
so. Yeah. And you don't realize what your actual interest or what. So this was how I found.
Okay, that's amazing to know, and it's quite important for one to discover the interest early in life and then excel in those interests, and that's exactly what you've done. So you spent about a year at UP Jindal Global University, Jindal Global Law School. How was the experience of probably how was the experience of studying at Jindal Global Law School? That is something that would be interesting to know.
So mine was the first batch of masters at Jindal, and it used to be a 2-year course back then.
Oh yes,
It was
that's exactly my
later
history.
that
I have the
UGC,
yes.
yes, yeah, because later UGC then changed it to 1-year course, so it was 2 years course back then. And so as I finished my LL.B, I thought I will not take up further studies and I should join the profession, which I did for 2 months. And Jindal announced an entrance exam and scholarships. And somehow, after a month or two, then I thought maybe, let's just give the entrance exam and let's see. Um, and then I got scholarship offer. So then I took it up. And I thoroughly enjoyed my master's for two reasons. I think the best thing that I learned at Jindal was how to ask questions and then how to look for their answers. So the most important skill that I learned at Jindal was how to do research. And I think the credit, that now I am into research full time, the credit does go to Jindal for that, because I wrote in the first semester, it's like learning swimming. So they teach you, of course, for a few days, but at some point the coach would throw you in the water and push you to swim, and so everybody has that kind of experience. So in the first semester, we were forced to write papers in almost all subjects. So we had 5 subjects. I remember we wrote 4 research papers in the first semester. And one of those papers got published in a foreign journal. That was a big achievement coming from DU. DU has a very different pedagogy. So they believe in case law method of teaching, and most students from DU either get into most of them get into litigation, or some of them apply for UPSC. They basically want to get into IS
Yeah, those
administrative
are the two broad
services.
areas that the youth students
Yes,
go to.
yeah. And so doing research or writing papers, this was the first time that I learned at Jindal. And another interesting thing that happened to me, that although Jindal had announced only 3 specializations, and mine was trade law specialization, the other two, one was I think corporate law, the other one was IP. Uh, After a year, I realized that the paper that I wrote as part of my law and economics subject, it was on legal profession. It was an economic analysis of the Advocates Act, and I decided that I'm more interested in doing my dissertation on the same subject and not really on trade law. And thanks to the flexibility given to me at Jindal, that I was allowed to do that. Similarly, in my 4th semester, the authorities, the management allowed me to take up a job, a part-time job, and as well as I was allowed to teach first year BLB students as a teaching assistant. I don't know if that's part of the course now, if that flexibility is there or
That's
not, but
something
at
that is
least
followed. Yes, that's
yeah,
something that is
yeah.
followed
So
for.
as a master's student, I could do that, and I also enjoyed doing that. So that was great. In fact, I did some great internships while I was at Jindal. So after my first year, before the final year, I think there was a gap of 3 months. So one of my internship was with a Supreme Court judge, Justice Ganguly, for a month. He offered me clerkship, in fact. And, I thought next year, because I still have a year to go and I am doing my master's full time, I can't take up a job. And then when I went back to college, told the authorities that I had gotten a job. I mean, I was offered a clerkship, and they told me, why didn't you take it up? You could have, there was a possibility of doing some alternative, some arrangement, but you shouldn't have left that offer. But I mean, still, it was great excitement to get that offer. And then I also did an internship with SEBI in Mumbai. Although corporate law was not really my subject, but there I managed to do some, I think it was research work on some policy matters. So that was also fine. Uh, so overall, I think Jindal was a great learning experience. Yeah, it was a intellectually stimulating experience. Especially, I enjoyed my law and economics classes.
Amazing to hear, and it seems like the gamut of experience is something that you managed to gather in those two years of your LLM. And research and writing is so important to us as lawyers. That is all we do all day. And if you ask the right questions, you will get the right answers. So that's also a
Yeah,
very important skill that you
yeah,
learned at
well said.
Jindal.
Yes, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. This is why learning to ask question is so important. Yeah.
It's very important. So, what are some of the professional milestones that you have had so far in your legal journey? Yeah.
So as I told you that I joined a job, I took up a job in my final semester. So this was in a litigation chamber in the Supreme Court where I worked for almost 1.5 years. And then the firm had a split. Uh, so I decided to move on. And this was when Center for Civil Society was coming up with a legal initiative, a public interest law initiative called iJustice. And I got an offer from Center for Civil Society to take that up. So I joined CCS then, and I was there almost for 4 years. Uh, so I wrote papers on Right to Education Act. They work basically in two main areas. One was school education, so policies and research related to school education. And the second was livelihoods. And it was around then they were also working on a project on ease of doing business reforms. So I got to work on both these projects. So the interesting part of my job profile that I could do a little bit of litigation, a bit of research, and also a bit of teaching, because Center for Civil Society also had a vertical called Academy. Academy organizes workshops and seminars for students. And I used to conduct sessions on education policy, on rule of law, on livelihoods. So this was great. This was just the right combination for me to do all three: litigation, research, and also teaching. After 4 years, actually after 2 years, I again, that was this itch of learning, the same thing. I always tell myself that, okay, this is enough. I don't want to learn further. I don't want to enroll. But after some time, then again that itch that I should take up more learning. And then I decided to take a PhD. I didn't want to leave my job. And so I applied to Jawaharlal Nehru University close to my place. And interestingly, again, they had a provision uh, that you didn't really have to leave their job. I mean, so many students take up their PhD while doing jobs, but as per the rules, if you really want to continue with your work, then you have to get permission from your employer as well as your center chairperson. So I was lucky. Uh, my employer encouraged me, and the center chairperson also generously, kindly allowed me to continue with my job. And so 2 years I continued, with my PhD while having my job. Third year, then I decided, I think this was in 2018, then I decided that probably I need to, uh, curtail my workload so as to give more time to my studies. And so then I took up a teaching job at Delhi University. I think it was probably for a semester or so. And plus, I also did part-time consultancy for an international foundation. And then in my final year of PhD, I almost said, no to any kind of work. So 1 year I had to dedicate just to my PhD. So I submitted my thesis last year, just waiting for the Viva to happen. Yeah.
Congratulations for that. We all understand who are in academics that what a big milestone that is.
Thanks.
So, Prashant, having done so much so far, and of course, there's the journey ahead as well. What are some of the things that you're looking forward to in your professional journey going forward?
So as I said, I submitted the thesis. I'm waiting for the defense to happen. So definitely that's something that's on my mind. It can happen any time in the coming few days. It's likely to happen. So that's the most important thing. Apart from that, as far as the work part is concerned, we have a couple of interesting projects going on. So of course, one is the street vendor. We recently launched, the third version of our annual report, Compliance Index. That's something. And we're working on a project called Quality of Regulation, where we are we have come up with a list of safeguards that should be applied to any law that the Parliament comes up with, or the government, the cabinet proposes to the Parliament. So it's sort of a checklist to gauge the quality of the law. That the law should have some sort of democratic safeguards, should have some sort of legal, administrative safeguards, and economic safeguards. So we're working on the quality of regulation. That's an interesting project.
That sounds amazing. That sounds like a lot is there in the pipeline in the near future and going forward as well for you. Now let's get into the topic for today, which all our attendees are curious to know about. Of course, we have read about it in the newspapers. Of course, law students and aspirants of law, as well as young lawyers, have some clue about the Street Vendors Act 2014. But it will be good to hear your perspective on the social legislation, which is of utmost importance in these times, wherein India is grappling with so many issues which have been sort of amplified due to the COVID-19 crisis as well. So, over to you, Prashant. Can you give us a brief overview of the Act, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritties of our discussion?
Sure. So, this act is titled as the Street Vendors Protection of Livelihood and Regulation of Street Vending Act. So basically two objectives. One is protection of livelihood, and the second is regulation of street vending. Now, one question we need to ask is, what does this law protect street vendors from? What are you protecting them from? And if you look at the preceding reports, there are committee reports, parliamentary committee report. Before the act was passed, there was a report. And the report tells us that the idea is to protect street vendors from police harassment, corruption of the municipal officials. So they were harassed, they were evicted without any due process. So what this act does, there is a provision, the most important provision of this act is section 3, clause 3, which is that no street vendor can be evicted without a survey. So the municipal authority, the TVC, they have to conduct a survey. And only after a survey is conducted and the certificate of vending has been given, then a street vendor can be evicted. And there are grounds for eviction on how a street vendor has to be evicted, the process, and on what grounds can a street vendor be evicted. But the survey is a must. Without a survey, no street vendor can be evicted. This is the key feature of the act. Number two, the act also envisages a participatory body which would have representatives of different stakeholders. However, this would have 40% representatives from street vendors, and these representatives among street vendors would be elected representatives. So, which means that there will be election of street vendors, and 40% member of the town vending committee, which is the participatory institution. 40% representatives would be elected representatives of street vendors. This is the second feature, right? So, this is a central act made by the parliament, and the state governments have to implement the law. And the state governments have been delegated the power to make rules and the scheme. So for example, the details about the institutional setup. So for example, uh, about the town vending committee, then there would be a grievance redressal cell. So those details have to be dealt in the rules, whereas other nitty-gritties, so for example, the holding capacity, or who would sit where, how would it be, the spots be allocated, and those functional details would be part of the scheme. The scheme has to be actually be city specific, although most states have come up with state level schemes. So this is what the act looks like.
Sorry. That's an interesting overview of the Street Vendors Act 2014. One of the questions that arise from what you've spoken and from the general analysis of the Street Vendors Act 2014 is, let's go back and understand the passing of the law itself. When street vending is a municipal issue, or is largely considered as so, why did the parliament go ahead and pass this law? It's a technical sort of question that I'm asking you as of now, that if you look at the division of powers and you look at the lawmaking powers, why did the parliament go ahead and pass this law when, street vending is strictly a municipal issue?
Yeah. So, we need to go back to 1980s. So in 1980s, there were a couple of cases. I think one from Delhi, one from Mumbai. So first, the Mumbai cases was, I think it was Bombay Hawkers Union, and there was one case from Delhi, Sudan Singh. So Sudan Singh and Bombay Hawkers Union challenged some provisions of the Bombay Municipality Act. Uh, these provisions, so the problem with many of the uh, colonial legislation is, especially in case of the municipal acts, that the municipal acts give lot of, they give sweeping powers, this delegate sweeping powers to the authority to make bylaws. And there is very less or no guidance given as to what those bylaws would be, on what basis those bylaws would be framed, or there is no guidance given as to how those details are to be decided. So there is a lot of discretion with the authority, how they frame the bylaws. So similarly, the municipal corporations could frame the bylaws to regulate street vending, and there were provisions in the Municipal Act that enabled the municipal commissioner or the authorities to frame bylaws related to street vending. The problem was that there was huge sweeping discretion, sweeping delegation, and no guidance given. This was the core issue in the whole, the setup, in the whole scenario. This was the crux. So when the union challenged these provisions before the Supreme Court, the issue was basically an administrative law issue, that you have sweeping discretion, you have so much of delegation, and there is no guidance. And hence, the bylaws are ultra virus, or if the bylaws do not have principles of, they don't conform to principles of natural justice, or they don't have administrative safeguards. You have so many Supreme Court judgments on this. So the court could have done a judicial review of those provisions based on, the administrative law principles, and could have decided that. But the court didn't do that. And this is where the problem starts, right? So first thing, for example, in Bombay Hawkers Union, what the court does, the court, becomes a little bit of activist, and the court tries to mediate the dispute, right? Instead of doing a judicial review based on administrative law principles, the court tries to reach to a settlement between the vendors and the municipal corporation. So the court tells the municipal corporation that, why don't you devise a scheme? Now, this is not the court's job, and this is where the whole problem started, right? So if you look at Bombay Hawkers Union judgment of 1985, 85 or 86, you see the court passing a scheme in its order. It's not a judgment that decides the legality of those provisions or the constitutionality of those provisions. Instead, it passes an order with the scheme. And the scheme is, it basically passes directions. It basically creates a law that your kiosk size should be this much, your timings of business should be from this time to that time, and so on and so forth, which was again not court's business to do that. The problem with this is that since courts function, constitutional function based on separation of powers doctrine, is to do judicial review. So if the court would pass a scheme and the scheme is problematic, then who would review that scheme, right? Now the vendors can't go to the High Court to challenge that scheme because this is, this has some stamp of approval from the Supreme Court. They can't go back to the Supreme Court, well, because Supreme Court has, kind of approved that scheme. So they, this is how this problem started. And some scholars have said, this judicialization of administrative law is good and so on, but I don't agree with that. I think we need to respect the separation of powers doctrine very strictly, and this is what had led to a problem in this case. Something similar happened in the Sodhan Singh case in 1989. So Sodhan Singh is a street vendor. He used to do business near Janpat in Delhi, and he applied for a license, right? His license was not renewed, and probably he was evicted. He goes to the Supreme Court, files a writ petition, and he says, I haven't received my renewed license. I've applied for the license, but it's not renewed. It seems that the NDMC, the New Delhi Municipal Council, had also not even responded to his application. So it's not, the license is not granted, but it's probably not even rejected, and no reasons are given to the vendor, right? So this also is an administrative law problem, right? So a vendor applying for license, he doesn't get a license, but he doesn't also get a clear rejection in writing, and he doesn't know the reasons because he's not been even conveyed the reasons for why there has been no response, right? But the same thing happens now. This time NDMC says, well, how can he even approach the Supreme Court? But because he has no fundamental right. There is no fundamental right in street vending. And the Supreme Court gets swayed by this contention, right? The Supreme Court gets confused by this contention that is there a fundamental right to squat and do street vending or not, which is very, very problematic, right? Because our constitution believes in a presumption of liberty. The constitution doesn't give us rights. It declares, it affirms those rights. So people have those rights. The constitution gives the power to the state to curtail those rights, reasonably restrict those rights, right? But it doesn't mean that the state gives us the right or the constitution gives us the rights. The constitution affirms, well, there is a right, and it gives the power to the state to reasonably restrict those rights. If that's the position, this means that everybody has the freedom to do street vending, right? Freedom to do any profession, trade, business, or occupation, as long as there is no reasonable restriction. And of course, if there is a restriction, you can challenge it whether it's reasonable or not, and the court will have to review with the reasonableness of the restriction. The problem is when the court got confused, is this fundamental right or not? Then the court said, okay, we will constitute a larger bench. Is this a fundamental right or not? And they did that. They constituted a 5-judge bench. Ultimately, they came up with the conclusion that yes, it is a fundamental right. But they say now the individual petitions will be heard by smaller benches. And then I tried looking for, judgments passed by the smaller benches, and there is none, flowing from that judgment. What happens is the later judgments, later orders record that in 1990, those individual petitions were forwarded to a Lok Adalat. And wait, Lok Adalat. So writ petitions forwarded to Lok Adalat is something bizarre, right? Now people, of course, question when such things happen, but those things are not something new. I mean, constitutional violation. So Article 32 clearly says it's a guarantee given by the Constitution, the Supreme Court has to judicially review if a fundamental right is violated, if a writ petition is filed. And the Supreme Court forwarding writ petitions of street vendors to Lok Adalat. So nobody has written about it. Nobody has ever questioned it. So this was absolutely bizarre. And then you see all other orders passed from 1985 to 2013. And all those orders passed in different cases, be it Sudhir Madan in 2005, or be it Maharashtra Ekta Hawkers Union, and so on and so forth. All these judgments from 1985 to 2013, all these orders are actually not judicial review, right? These are all orders passed in some sort of executive capacity of the Supreme Court, which means that the court was playing an activist role. The court was, I think activism is not a good word because activism has some positive connotation. This is encroachment, they call street vendors as encroachers, but the Supreme Court itself was encroaching executive and the legislative space. It was doing two things. It was making committees after committees. It took a district court judge in Delhi and asked the judge to go out in the streets and counter street vendors. It made a committee of the district judge, right? Similarly, something similar they did in Mumbai. And so almost for 25 years, the Supreme Court was being a super regulator of street vending in Delhi and Mumbai.
That's interesting to know. You have actually taken us through the entire judicial history of the Street Vendors Act 2014 and how it came to this point. Is there something that you want to add on to this?
Yeah. So, what happened is by 2007 and then 2010, there were orders in which Supreme Court realized that it's on the wrong path, right? Because now hundreds and thousands of petitions were being filed. So, for example, there was a vendor in Delhi who wanted to switch from garments business to tea business. And this vendor sought approval from the municipal authority, and the municipal authority, NDMC, told this person that you should go to the Supreme Court Constituted Committee. Then he approaches the Supreme Court Constituted Committee to change his business. The committee says, we'll put up your application before the Supreme Court. So imagine somebody who wants to change his business, switch a business, a vendor who wants to switch his business from garments to tea, he has to go all the way to the Supreme Court to seek permission, to seek approval from the Supreme Court. So this was the state of affairs. So these are the second order consequences of the, the judicial encroachment. So by 2010, the court realized that it can't really handle so many petitions because it's just going, overboard, and it has to come to an end. So then the court said, we took it up because there was no law and we had to pass directions, but we now request the parliament to make a law. And until the law comes into existence, we pass some directions, and there is a national policy on street vendors 2009, and we direct the governments, all the state governments, to implement the policy until a new law is framed by the parliament. But I argue that this position put forward by the Supreme Court was incorrect. This is false. Why? It's not that there was a legislative vacuum. You remember when we started, I said in 1985, there were provisions in the municipal corporation laws of Delhi as well as Mumbai. What the court should have ideally done is it should have judicially reviewed those provisions and should have given a judgment on whether those provisions are legal, illegal, constitutional or unconstitutional. But it started with the premise that instead of reviewing those provisions, it started passing directions, and that's where the problem started. So the court actually pushed the parliament to make a law. And, there was a policy, a legislative policy in 2004, sorry, not a legislative policy, there was a national policy put forward by the central government in 2004, and then there was a revised policy in 2009. And the court also in its directions was emphasizing on stakeholder representation and consultation, right? Make committees. So that committee culture also percolated. And this is why in this law you see a town vending committee. The court also considered questions of zoning in its orders passed, and this is why you see a great deal of the idea of zoning in the law. So a lot of elements of court's orders and a lot of elements from 2004 and 2009 policies are reflected in the current law. So it's very important if you want to understand 2014 law to go back to the court's orders passed between 1985 to 2013, as well as the 2004 and 2009 policies. And this is why, our law is so peculiar and so complicated.
Yes, of course. I mean, there has been an entire gamut of exercises before we have got this act into place, and a lot of tussle between the judiciary and the executive. But that is what is interesting to see in India, where you don't have a strict separation of powers. Often the line between overstepping and sort of overlapping of the functions gets blurred. But it's interesting to note the lacuna in terms of the gaps that the Supreme Court wasn't able to identify as per your perspective when it comes to the Municipal Act having some laws in place, but the Supreme Court not paying heed to that. Uh, Having known all that and understanding the backdrop of the law as it is today, uh, what do you think are the major problems that the Street Vendors Act 2014 is trying to address? Because often what happens is that it takes a while in the social evolution of issues to understand the real problem, the underlying issues, and then you give a recommendation based on those issues that you have identified. I'm sure with the Street Vendors Act 2014 as well, there are certain key issues that have been outlined or that have been identified by the Act itself, which then the Act tries to remedy. So if you could throw some light on that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned about the parliamentary committee that produced a report before the act, and it acknowledged that street vendors face a lot of harassment from the municipal officials and police. And this is where, this is where the idea of protection of livelihood comes from, that they need protection from the municipal officials and the harassment that they face from the police. The question that I want to ask is, how does it protect street vendors from municipal officials and the police, right? So it says that no street vendor shall be evicted before a survey is done. But what if a street vendor is evicted by the police or is evicted by the municipal official? Then what happens? Then the street vendor has to go to the court to enforce Section 3, Clause 3. And then what happens? So, we did a we did a research of all the judgments on orders passed by all the high courts in the country between, I think, October 2017 to January 2019. It was, I think, a period of 16-18 months on Street Vendors Act. And we found out that majority of the most of the judgments, the orders passed by the Delhi High Court, a particular judge, he refused to acknowledge Section 3.3. He says that those who are evicted, they are not street vendors, right? They are encroachers. The problem is that the Act does not define encroacher because there is nobody as encroacher. The Act simply says that whoever is vending in the street is a street vendor, and as long as you can accommodate up to number of street vendors that are up to 2.5% of the local population. So at least for the existing vendors, no vendor will be evicted if their number is less than 2.5% of the local population. So which means, for example, let's say in Sonipat, if the population of Sonipat, urban Sonipat is, let's say, 1 lakh, then you cannot evict a vendor if the numbers of vendors does not exceed 2,500, right? So which means, and in most of the cities and towns, if you look at the data, the number of street vendors is around 1% to 1.5%. So the legislature had built in this safeguard that, you know, the number is very, very accommodative of the street vendors, and no street vendor would need to be evicted, at least as far as the previous data is to go by. You know, the administration could easily accommodate all the existing vendors. Of course, if the new vendors come, then there is a lottery and other mechanisms one needs to see. But existing vendors, there is no problem. The point that I'm trying to make is that vendors continue to be evicted, and when they approach the courts, the High Court did not really respect the spirit of the act, right? In many cases, it said they are not encroachers because they were not part of the previous survey. Now, which previous survey? Surveys conducted by Supreme Court constituted committees in 92 or 2004 or 2006. So there were a couple of 2-3 surveys done before. So those surveys. But you have a new law passed by the parliament. And the law nowhere says that, you know, that the street vendor is somebody who is a formal street vendor or who is acknowledged or enumerated by a committee or by the administration. The whole idea of a Street Vendor Act is to protect and formalize vendors because they were not formalized before. So if those street vendors are enumerated, if they are protected, if they are identified by any previous surveys, then you don't need the act, right? So High Court of Delhi especially has actually defeated the purpose of the act. And High Court of Delhi in this avatar, you know, in its way of thinking, in this mindset, is actually no different from the police and the administration, right? It actually toes that line. It actually follows the same line of thinking that the municipal officials and the police also believes in. So the law has failed to, in that sense, protect street vendors because the High Court has not really interpreted it as per the objective of the act. This is only one problem. So, you know, by design, the act has no safeguards against the police and against the municipal authority if they don't comply with the law, if they don't conform to the provisions, if they don't adhere to the provisions of the law. Similarly, the act said that, you know, the state governments have to notify rules and schemes. And many states, now most states have done, but you know, after a very, very long time. Similarly, a town vending committee. So the municipal authorities, you know, be the municipal corporation or the municipal councils in towns and cities, they have to hold street vendor elections and have to constitute town vending committees. But what if the municipal authority doesn't do that, right? The act says you constitute TVC, town vending committee. But if the municipal corporation doesn't do its duty, what do you do? So there is no penalty. There is no incentive or disincentive for the municipal corporation if it doesn't do what it is supposed to do. This is a problem in the act, right? And the problem is that the incentives of the street vendors and the incentive of the authority and its officials, they don't align well. And the act doesn't, you know, align their incentives. Because if the municipal authority, you know, constitutes a town vending committee, then the rent seeking that the municipal officials benefit from, you know, the extortion and the corruption and evictions, that won't happen, right? So this is why the officials, it is in their interest to keep the cycle going, yeah, to not formalize them so that we continue to charge money. I know vendors who pay 3,000 rupees every month to different authorities, to cops, to municipal officials, to other people, including the local shopkeeper, you know, basically to buy his tent so that he doesn't complain to the authority. So street vendors are paying huge money to different people every month, just that this money is not going to the government funds. Now, imagine if they were to formalize, it would be a win-win situation. A, the vendors would be formalized. They won't have to face insecurity. They won't have to face harassment and evictions. Plus, the municipal corporations will be making much more money. They would be rich. Imagine if Delhi has 200,000 vendors and every vendor pays 6,000 rupees or 3,000 rupees every month. it would be crores of money, right?
Yes. That is interesting to know, especially some of the technicalities that you've introduced us to, and also the gaps in the response to the problem which arises because of street vendors or for the street vendors in terms of their protection from harassment in the system. Before we proceed to the next question, I would just a word to the attendees. We have been receiving some questions, and you can keep posting those questions, and we will be moving to the Q&A in a couple of minutes. So my next question to you, Prashant, really is, of course, you have detailed the Street Vendors Act 2014. You've also told us what is right, what is wrong, what can be done in order to achieve the objectives of the Act. And we also are very much aware of the rule of law situation in India is not as desirable as it should be. And we are certainly working towards it. All the limbs of the government are working towards it, especially the citizens. So, in that whole gamut of things, and in that context, would you say that the implementation of the Street Vendors Act 2014 is taking place at a minimal level? Is it taking place in a good way, or are there some improvements, some recommendations that you would suggest to the Street Vendors Act 2014 itself for improving its implementation?
Yeah, so we have been at CCS, we have been tracking the implementation of the Act. We came up with the first report in 2017, and here I would like to acknowledge and thank Professor Yugang Goyal because he was instrumental in designing the index. We both worked on it and came up with the idea and designed the index together. Uh, so first report we brought out in 2017, that the second one was 2018-19 version, and third we just launched. And our reports actually demonstrate, it shows the poor state of implementation across India. So although the states have notified rules and schemes, but the schemes are not city specific. They are at the state level. That's first problem. Number two, town vending committees have not been constituted for most cities and towns. Last year, when we looked at the data, I think out of 7,500, only one third cities, towns, urban local bodies had constituted town vending committees. This year, we had the data only for 3,500 or so. And I think 2,700 or 800 had constituted the town vending committees. So yeah, I can give you the exact numbers. Out of 3248 ULBs, around 2,433 ULBs had formed at least one town vending committees, which is 75% of the ULBs that reported the data, right? But if you look at the total number of ULBs and the data we got from the government, so this is Ministry of Housing Urban Affairs, the ministry's data. So the data itself is for, I think, one third of the cities. So out of one third, this is 75% of the one third. So yeah, right. And then in 6 states, less than half of the ULBs have town vending committees. So, the next question I wanted to also check, and we couldn't get data for it, that how many town vending committees have actually held their first meetings. And we have interacted with street vendors from Rajasthan. In fact, recently we had a state level consultation in 4 or 5 states. We did consultations, some discussions on the implementation of the Act in Haryana, in Rajasthan, in Maharashtra, in Andhra, in Telangana. And one thing that is common in all these states is that the town vending committee meetings are not happening. Okay? So even at those places where town vending committees have been constituted, the meetings are not taking place. So I think there is a design flaw in the Act, right? And for example, if you ask further questions, so for example, the local body is supposed to do zoning. Zoning meaning the dividing the, the localities into vending zone, no vending zone, and also designating certain markets as natural markets or heritage markets, right? Now, you must have come across, if you're from Delhi, you must have come across Daryaganj Book Bazaar case, right? So the Book Bazaar, which has been going on for decades, right? That Book Bazaar was evicted, that was removed from that place. Now the act clearly says that, markets that are natural markets, that have witnessed congregation of sellers and buyers naturally for many years. Those are natural markets, and among those natural markets, markets that have been going on for decades and that are known for, they're famous. Those markets should be designated as heritage markets. So heritage market is that those who have been going for more than 5 decades. Those are heritage.
Yeah.
Correct, right? And Daryaganj Book Bazaar is a heritage market. Just that the municipal body had not acknowledged it like that. But I mean, everybody knows that it's a heritage market because it's been going on for more than 50 years and people know about it. And, it's kind of that people know Delhi by Daryaganj Book Bazaar. It's like the Indore Sarafa.
One of the cultural, there's cultural significance to it. Yes.
Right. It's similar to, the Sarafa Bazaar of Indore. People especially go to Indore to have food in the Sarafa market in the evening, right? So Daryaganj Book Bazaar had that kind of significance. And if you look at the Delhi High Court past order, there is not even a mention of Street Vendors Act in the judgment, right? So what I'm trying to say that the act is just not being implemented. It's a tokenism. There is a very superficial implementation. So superficial or tokenism, you see that the act and rules have been passed, and the rules are also somewhat against the vendors. We have analyzed, so I have analyzed rules and schemes of, I think, 27, 28 states. And this was part of our report. So the rules and schemes are not very encouraging, but the act is so difficult to implement that it's not being implemented. The meetings are not taking place and surveys are not being done. So, the problem of street vending was acute. The problem of regulation and formalization and harassment, these problems were acute in Delhi and Mumbai. So you see in these two cities specifically, especially in Mumbai, last survey happened in 2014. As per estimates, Mumbai is supposed to have some figure between 2 lakhs to 3 lakhs vendors, or probably more than 3 lakh vendors. But the form was distributed to 1.25 lakh vendors, and 99,000 submitted their forms. And one of the conditions to become a street vendor was domicile. You have got to be Marathi Manus, right? Or you must have stayed there in the city for 15 years. So that's enough soil politics. And now newspapers have different figures. Some newspapers say 15,000 vendors were formalized. Some say 17,000 got their licenses. But imagine out of 1.25 lakh vendors, you have only 15,000 vendors that got formalized, that got the certificate of vending, that eventually got licensed. So would you call it, success of the act? This is abysmal failure of the act. Similarly, in Delhi, if you see, Delhi is a much more complicated and case because municipal corporations are not really under the state government, right? And they have, of course, a different political party in power. State government, there's a different political party in power. And state government has not been able to get the act implemented through municipal corporations, right? So the municipal corporation are supposed to get the survey done. They're supposed to constitute the town vending committees, so on and so forth. The act has not been implemented in Delhi. So it's so problematic. So in these two cities especially, the harassment and the extortion is continued. The courts have not really come to help the street vendors. They have passed rather adverse judgments. They have not applied the act in some judgments, and in other judgments, they have interpreted it against the street vendors when the language is quite clear, but they have interpreted it otherwise. So, yeah.
So, Prashant, knowing all of this, and of course, there is an evolution through which every act goes. Firstly, there's awareness, and there are mistakes. Then you remedy those mistakes because it also has to seep into the normal public discourse as well as the judicial discourse. So, under that regard, how do you think if there's a poor implementation of the act at this point, how do we move forward and get the judiciary or get the stakeholders to not only be more aware of the provisions of the act, but also to implement them for the benefit of the street vendors? So, some of the key recommendations that you would like to give.
So, here I would like to acknowledge the efforts put in by the National Urban Livelihood Mission of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, the central government, because in association with NULM department, we at Center for Civil Society have been able to uh, get the compliance index moving, because now they give us the data, they share the data with us, and we have brought the third version of the index, which has helped to create some sort of competition amongst the states, and the states are now taking the act somewhat seriously, right? But the actual implementation has to be at the municipal level. And what I underlined is that there is a design flaw in the act because it doesn't align the incentives of various stakeholders. So there is a problem in the act. Uh, so I am of the view that this requires amendment, and just emphasizing on the implementation would not suffice. You have to amend the act. So, a common example is, for example, let's say the car parking model in Delhi, right? You don't need a town vending committee. You don't need the representation of car owners in a committee to say that, how cars would be parked in Delhi. So you see in commercial districts or commercial markets, like say Connaught Place, how cars are parked. So usually the space is auctioned by the municipal corporation, and you have a contractor, they give you a ticket, they charge 20 rupees per hour or 50 rupees per hour, and you park your car, right? So in world over, there are such models where parking spaces or the vending spaces are auctioned to a private contractor, and this is how it goes on. This is one model. But the other model is just to restrict the police and the municipal officials from harassing the vendors, right? And just formalize them. Formalize them in the sense, just protect them from harassment and say that, for example, pedestrian. Pedestrian has a right to walk on the footpath, right? Nobody harasses. So similarly, as far as the mobile vendors are concerned, there should absolutely be no question of harassment. And as far as the stationary vendors are concerned, there has to be much more transparency in terms of how you allocate spots. There has to be administrative safeguards. So when a person applies for renewal of license, then you should definitely give them a reply, either accept or issue the license within some time period, telling which it would be deemed to be approved or deemed to be licensed given. So I think we need robust safeguards. We need robust models of allocation. And I think the act needs to be amended and has to be at par with the best practices or the international practices in this area.
That's very interesting to know because not only did you took us through an entire gamut of a research area, telling us what the problem exactly is, what the act is trying to do, where it is hitting those sixes and where it is missing the problem or addressing the problem itself, and also have suggested now going through all the judiciary and the executive and everyone who was involved in the Street Vendors Act 2014, that what can be done moving forward to protect or to achieve the objectives of the Street Vendors Act 2014. That has been very educative for all of us. And before I move on to the questions for today, and we have received a number of them, uh, I would like to ask you that are these reports available publicly from the Center for Civil Society? But it seems like you have done a lot of work on this. And also, if you could name some other organizations for early career researchers, if they could look at the work they have done on street vendors. Yes.
Yeah. So yes, all the reports are available on CCS website. All you need to do is go to ccs.in, go to research, and you will see all our reports listed there and papers. Yeah.
I must congratulate you for the immense work you're doing in this area, and it's like serious. It's actually a lot of research, and it's a lot of contribution to the field, and I'm sure people are going to benefit from that. So now let's move on to the questions. So the first question, so I'm clubbing a number of questions. A lot of attendees have asked this question, and you have touched upon it in your presentation in a way, where they're saying that the Street Vendors Act 2014 and some of the Municipal Corporation Acts have inconsistencies between them, and so do state administered laws have inconsistencies between them. For example, the Brihan Mumbai Municipal Corporation in Mumbai asked for domicile certificate as an eligibility requirement to get the vending license. So, how do we deal with these inconsistencies of laws, and what is your take on that?
So these are questions of administrative law. In our analysis of the rules and schemes, we highlighted these provisions, that these provisions go beyond the mandate of the street vending law. So some states, for example, and Maharashtra was not the only one. There are other states. I think Andhra had a resident requirement. Delhi had a voter ID card requirement. Tripura also had a voter ID card requirement, if I'm not wrong. And so the Act does not prescribe these requirements. And this is something that the state governments have come up. So the inconsistency, I mean, this is again a question of judicial review. So some vendor will need to go to the court and challenge this. The question is, will the courts do what they are supposed to do constitutionally? They didn't do that in 1985, in 1989, and until 2013. Will they do it? Quite unlikely, right? They're busy deciding the height of Dahi Handi. They're busy deciding how much water to pour over the Mahakaleshwar Shivling. They're busy deciding making national anthem mandatory in the the cinema halls. But what they are constitutionally mandated to do under Article 32, that's something they have not really done so far.
And that's a sad state of affairs, and I'm sure
That's
that many of them are willing to do it, but just given the judicial overload and the pendency and the politicization sometimes, that some issues do take a back seat. And that's something that has happened with the Street Vendors Act, unfortunately, and its implementation. But people like you who are actively working towards making it more recognized and creating awareness, recommending, would certainly add to making it a much more significant issue than it already is in the public discourse. The second question, which a number of the attendees have asked us, Prashant, is that a number of our street vendors are not well educated, or they did not get an opportunity to attend school, or they are barely able to read and write. In that scenario, and also they're outside the formal system of law, meaning to say that they don't access courts as regularly as other people, right? So in that scenario, how do you make them firstly aware of the existence of the law, their rights under the legislation, and if we are unable to create that level of awareness, then they would continue to suffer. So how do we deal with this basic fundamental issue of creating awareness about the Street Vendors Act 2014, the rights and liabilities of the street vendors within the Act, so that they know that they have some rights and they are protected within the law?
Thanks, Shireen. So a couple of points. One is, I think the awareness is not as problematic as deliberate ignorance. So, the example I gave you of Delhi High Court orders, I think there is deliberate ignorance. They're choosing to look at the other side. They're choosing to ignore and not look at the Street Vendor Act. They pretend that as if the act doesn't exist, right? Similarly, same is the case with the police and the municipal officials. So awareness is not really as problematic as this deliberate ignorance, because the vendors who even manage to go to the courts are not able to get justice. Number two, street vendors, not all of them are poor and illiterate, by the way. Last year in September, in August, some street vendors approached me because they were being charged heavy penalties by the Metropolitan Magistrate. Metropolitan Magistrates are the lowest ranked judicial officers. that are housed in the municipal corporation and the SDMC, for example, and they preside over offenses done under the Municipal Corporation Act, Delhi Municipal Corporation Act 1957. So these are minor offenses. So for example, nuisance, sanitation related offenses. So if you look at the provisions of Delhi Municipal Corporation Act, the penalty for violations are 50 rupees, 100 rupees, so on and so forth. So the vendors came to me and told me that they are being they've been issued challans, and so they are supposed to appear before the Metropolitan Magistrate. Now I had represented them before the Supreme Court. When Rajasthan government had refused to uh, implement the act, we challenged that, and we first challenged it before the Rajasthan High Court. Rajasthan High Court also, by the way, refused to implement the act, saying that the act doesn't apply to state of Rajasthan. And then we challenged that order before the Supreme Court, and eventually the Supreme Court agreed, and the state government agreed that yes, the law applies to them. But I didn't know about how municipal magistrates function. How does this work? So the street vendor's son told me that he had done Google search, and he found out that the penalty for this offense is 100 rupees, and the Metropolitan Magistrate has been charging them 2,000 rupees. And I didn't first believe him. I bought the act because we don't deal in Municipal Corporation Act. So then I personally checked the Bear Act, and I was like, yes, he's right. This guy even found a precedent, a judgment online, right? So not all the vendors are poor and illiterate. Some of them are very smart. And for others, it may be an issue of, language, but they know about their rights. So they may not be able to speak in English, but some of them, they know and understand their rights quite well. So we took up this matter, and the Metropolitan Magistrate, the problem is that these are retired officers who were in the executive branch of the state earlier, and now they are being made appointed as the judicial officer. So they don't know the procedures, right? And when I asked the order, he refused. I asked him for to argue, opportunity to argue and things like that. He didn't agree. So there were a lot of issues. Then finally we had to challenge his order, although he didn't even give a copy of the order. So we went to the sessions judge in Saket Court, and the judge passed an order remanding the records, and then checked, and then finally, we won the matter. He had to acquit. But what I'm trying to say is that even when there is awareness amongst the vendors, the system doesn't favor them. There is a systemic bias against the vendors, not just in the police branch, not just in the executive branch, but also in the judicial branch of the state. If those things work properly, or at least the judicial branch, works as it's supposed to, things won't be as bad as they are. Because at least, there are unions, there are associations of street vendors, and they go to, they approach the courts. But the problem is that they don't get justice.
And that's the problem, not only for street vendors, but across. And there are a lot of issues that come with getting justice, and it's difficult to get justice in India. Difficult, but not impossible. So that's a silver lining there. And all of us are working towards making justice more deliverable within the legal system. Another question that has come up really is that with the lockdown being lifted in a number of states, and people are going out and doing their businesses, and street vendors also have a right to work, but many of the state governments are not in the position to allow them when it comes to conducting their own businesses. So what is your, I know it's a complex issue, and there are several public health guidelines which have been issued around people doing their businesses, and there are a lot of compliance factors, but what is your perspective on it?
So, it depends on the way you look at it, whether the issue is complex or not. I think the issue is not complex. We spoke to street vendors. you know what they say? They say हम बीमारी की भूख की बजाय बीमारी से मरना पसंद करेंगे. It's better to die of COVID than by hunger, right? So when a person makes that statement, to me the issue is not complicated then. You know, the question is of choosing between hunger and COVID, and they go by COVID, and they say वो हम देख लेंगे हमारी immunity है कि we'll see whatever happens. But so, you know, it's a certain death by hunger if they choose to, or if they are forced to be confined to their homes, right?
Yes.
How can you then allow that to happen? Uh, so, you know, we took that matter up with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs in the central government. We submitted a draft of SOP, some guidelines that the state governments could issue and allow street vending. And luckily, you know, at the Delhi level, so we also were in touch with members of Delhi Dialogue and Development Commission, and we also gave them inputs on allowing it. And luckily, I think Delhi has allowed street vendors. This was last week or so that they came up with guidelines to allow street vendors. Weekly bazaars also, they said they will allow soon. I'm not too sure if they have allowed weekly bazaars or not yet, but at least street vendors they allowed. So, you know, as soon as there was an unlock down, they opened markets. Now the malls are opened, right? Malls are closed spaces and street vendors are open spaces, right? I am not an expert on public health, but what I understand, the basics of it is that there is higher likelihood of spreading of, you know, this disease in closed space, closed environment. So whereas in open environments, so it was not really a problem allowing street vendors. They should have allowed. Plus, you see vendors selling fruits and vegetables, right? When your hyperbars, when your supermarkets were all shut down, vendors were the only source of your daily vegetables and fruits in all last 4 or 5 months, right? They were the heroes. They risked their lives getting up early in the morning, 3 o'clock, going to the mandi, getting us our daily delivery of fruits and vegetables, right? They were the only ones who were open throughout these last 4 or 5 months. I mean, there was a time period when even the delivery services were shut, right? The vendors were the only ones. So there are heroes of, you know, during the COVID pandemic time.
I completely agree with it because we take certain sections of the society for granted, and I also feel that, and there are a number of questions on that. Do you think, Prashant, we have become a little less empathetic or lost that empathy and humanity when it comes to uh, living as a society to these issues which are social in nature because of the commercialization and the capitalism that has taken over our lives? Do you think that is one of the issues?
Yeah. So, you know, very interesting example I would like to give. Uh, Apart from street vendors, I also worked a bit on the issue of cycle rickshaw pullers. So after my LL.B, I worked with Indra Uni Nair, an advocate. She was working with Manushi on the cycle rickshaw puller case. And also briefly during my LL.B days, I produced a documentary called Third Wheel on the license Raj in auto rickshaw sector. So you don't see, you know, branded auto rickshaws. Why? Because it's one man, one permit policy. Similarly, in cycle rickshaws also is one man, one permit policy. This one man, one permit policy was a product of socialist mindset back in 70s. So, for example, government of Punjab as well as in Delhi, both had this one person, one license for cycle rickshaw policy. The idea was that, you know, you have people who buy a lot of cycle rickshaws and give it to the pullers on rent, and they extort a lot of rent. So, you know, these provisions were challenged in the Supreme Court in 1981, 83, 4 times, twice from Punjab and twice from Delhi. So there are 4 judgments by the Supreme Court. And I think Krishna Iyer has also written judgment, one of or two of those judgments. And Krishna Iyer says that, you know, this is this is basically to remedy the inequality. Yeah, there should be equality of cycle rickshaw ownership. Some people have hundreds of cycle rickshaws and they give it to rent to poor people, and poor don't have cycle rickshaws. So we want them to be the owner of cycle rickshaws. So the idea is, if you make a law, one person to have one license, they will magically become the owner of the cycle rickshaws, and there would be perfect equality in the society. And they did not do judicial review. So the same pattern, which I said in case of Sodan Singh, in case of Bombay Hawkers Union in 85, 89, the Supreme Court didn't do judicial review. The same thing happened in 1981, 83 in case of cycle rickshaw pullers case. The Supreme Court didn't do judicial review, just upheld the provision saying, no, this is very benevolent provisions. Basically perfect equality and let there be socialism in our country. Now, this provision was challenged in 2007 by Manushi Sangathan before Delhi High Court. And on 10th of February 2010, the Delhi High Court struck down this provision. Right? And you see, yeah, you see the two judgments. The Delhi High Court judgment doesn't make the entrepreneur. Yeah, he calls the person, I mean, so the person who had multiple cycle rickshaws before the judgment was pronounced, he was called as mafia. Why? Because he had multiple cycle rickshaws and he was giving it on rent and he was in conflict with the law. So he was a mafia. Right after the judgment was pronounced, he became an entrepreneur. Right? So look at the dignity that the law grants. Right? And one of the client was Muhammad Zia. You know, this guy came from Malda in West Bengal to Delhi in 80s. And he started pulling a rickshaw with barely some money in his pocket. So he rented a rickshaw, pulled it, saved some money, then bought the first rickshaw after a few months. In 2010, when I met him, you know how many rickshaws did he own? He owned 110 rickshaws. In some other country, he would have been awarded. You know, there would have been awards given to as, you know, from rag to rich story and best entrepreneur award and something like that. In our country, he was labeled as mafia. Right? So 2010 judgment liberated him from the stigma of mafia and actually made him an entrepreneur.
And look so hero for that.
Yeah. And I think we really need to see these things in the right perspective. Why? Because, you know, we live in a country where Ambanis have the economic freedom to open as many factories as they want, to open as many offices as they want. For that matter, even, you know, a shopkeeper in Delhi can open his branch stores. A university can open branch colleges. Panwala can open as many shops. A private car can, you know, a person owning a private car can have as many private cars as he wants to have. But when it comes to auto rickshaws, when it comes to cycle rickshaws, we see, and then we have all sort of arguments, not just socialism and not just ownership and equality argument, then we have congestion argument. Then we have pollution argument. So you see in MC Mehta in 1998, Supreme Court said that we don't want auto rickshaws because they are polluting. So diesel SUVs are not polluting. Auto rickshaws are polluting, and till date, Bhurelal Committee constituted by the Supreme Court, you know, same pattern. Committee constituted by the Supreme Court regulating street vending. Similarly, you have Bhurelal Committee constituted by the Supreme Court, which is regulating pollution. And you see how clean Delhi air has become now after auto rickshaws are regulated in last 20 years. Delhi has become utopia. It has become heaven of clean air and clean water, right? So, you know, while the judges had the best of intentions, Krishna Iyer had best of intention. What he didn't realize was, you know, the bad he was doing to the poor cycle rickshaw owners, the poor street vendors, the poor auto rickshaw drivers. So the court unintentionally actually ended up harming the poor people, the poorest of the poor that it intended to do good to. That's the irony of it.
That's wonderful insight that you have given us about the rickshaw pullers and as well as the street vendors. And what I really understand from you is that not only are you passionate about these issues, but also you have thoroughly read and made those connections about how the Supreme Court operates on these matters. That's all the time we have for the questions today, but I have the last two questions for you from our attendees. On behalf of our attendees, in fact, so our attendees are largely young lawyers, law, law school aspirants, and law students. So, from the law school aspirant perspective, the question that I really want to ask you is that what are the things that they should look at while choosing a law school? Because you and I both know that it can make a huge difference to you where you get your legal training from, and you have studied in some of the best institutions in India. So, what is your perspective on that?
So, I hear two kinds of argument from people when they have to choose a law school. It's sometimes, so one is definitely that the faculty quality has to be really good. The faculty ratio has to be, excellent so that you get good attention and you get quality teaching. And so faculty quality is, how accomplished is the faculty is one of the crucial factors, I think probably on top of my mind. Infrastructure matters a lot because, for example, what kind of digital resources, whether you have access to digital repositories for doing research, you have that or not, and things like that. And also the culture of research, right? Do you have a culture of research or not? And to me, I think research is very important. Even whether you choose to go for litigation or you choose to go for transactional lawyering, or you choose some other stream, maybe even judiciary. But to inculcate that curiosity, to inculcate that discipline of an academic inquiry, it's important to have that kind of academic culture. It's important to inculcate that discipline of reading and writing. I think that's important. So one should definitely look for a law school where these components are present. The counter argument is that sometimes people say that one should be self-driven, and a lot of people who go abroad for their legal education, they say, you spent so much of money, but sometimes what you get in return is not in proportion to what you spend. And to some extent, I do agree sometimes. And there was a book by Brian Kaplan, about the worth of higher education. What's so good about degrees? I'm forgetting the title of the book, but it's by Brian Kaplan. And he argues, he makes that point that sometimes the higher education degrees, there is a degree inflation now, because every other person has so first, it was every other person had a bachelor, so you have to have a master's. Now every person has a master's, so you have to have a PhD. And until you have a PhD, you can't be identified in the crowd. So there is a degree inflation. But do you really have those skills or not? Does the degree teach you? Does the degree impart any skills or not? And I think that's an important question. And many of the skills, so of course, research is one of the important skills. When you ask me about question about what I learned at Jindal, and this is why I remember Jindal so much, that I learned research skill at Jindal, and that's why it was very, very important for me. And I'm now into research. That's part of my profile. But there are a lot of other skills that I learned on the job. So I think a degree should be very, very practically oriented and should impart a lot of skills. In fact, I remember once I spoke to Dr. Rajkumar on this, because my master's dissertation topic was about legal profession. And currently, I'm also working on another paper, which is about the relevance of degree requirements, and especially in legal profession and teaching profession. So the question is, about, do we have those skill-based curriculum in our law school or not? And to what extent does it impart skills? So yeah, that's a question that a law student should answer. Before taking the admission, he should check the curriculum. And after taking the admission also, he should opt for courses that are skill-based, right? Knowledge you can acquire, you can read on your own. And plus, at best, law school can only impart knowledge of 30 laws or 45 laws. but it can't teach you all the laws. So at some point, you will end up learning the law yourself. But skills, it's slightly difficult to learn the skills yourself. And plus, this is the idea of a university, that you learn from the masters. They can give you feedback. So while I can, of course, join courses online and can learn skills on my own, but the whole point about a university is that you get the insights and the feedback. The most important part is the feedback, which you can't get on your own. So you have to have a master, and this is why you achieve mastery, because when you learn from the masters, and that can happen in a university. Yeah,
that's completely true, and I think it's very helpful for people who are deciding to pursue law at this point. It's also the competition exam season, and everyone is writing competition exams to sort of gain admissions in law schools. Another question that is for people who are already in law schools: how can they develop themselves as successful lawyers as you are today? While sitting in law school, because when we are in law school we have a different perspective of the legal profession, and one thing we try to go with the herd mentality that our friend is doing this or our professor is suggesting this, so why not try this. But we often fail to introspect on our own abilities, on our own aptitude, and take these decisions which are far away from what we would like to do. It's only after you come into the profession, spend a couple of years, that you really realize that your interests are what they are. So what is your guidance to law students currently studying law? Yes.
I think they should look for a mentor. So they should identify a person who they admire, who they like, who they want to be, some role model, and probably get in touch with the person and try and see, what is it that they can learn from the person's career path, right? So what is it that the person has accomplished and how did he go about doing that? And also reach out to the person and see, what is, and speak to the person and see, what is it that they can learn from him or her. That's one thing. Second thing is, legal challenges. There are challenges. It's especially in litigation, it's difficult for first generation lawyers, first generation entrants. It's easier for those who have some sort of family background. And I'm not saying that, this is nepotism and this is always bad. Of course, people who have family background would tend to do better because they have seen that setup before. They are very well acquainted with the thing. And so for them, it would be easier. And is it necessarily wrong? Probably not. But ideally, or how it would have been easier for first generation lawyers is, if the Bar Council were to allow, let's say, companies in our country to be law firms. So the problem with LLPs and the problem with partnership is that they tend to be dominated by families. So they continue to be run by families after families. However, in case of companies would have brought a lot more professionalism, and they would have provided, much better opportunities to first generation lawyers, and they would have respected merit more than the family connections. Unfortunately, we don't have that. So there are challenges. It's not that first generation lawyers have not done well. Few have done, but
Taken a bit of more time. Yeah.
It takes more time. There is much more struggle. That's for sure. Yeah.
One has to be aware of the challenges, and it's not like this does not exist in all industries. It exists in all industries all across the world. The idea is that we have to get out of that bubble when we're in law school and actually see the legal profession for what it is.
Sure. But Shirin, this is the difference here, no? That in other sectors, so for example, you have the corporate, right? So you can go to corporate sector where you have companies. So in law, luckily, I mean, those who get into transactional or lawyering, so you see the difference, right? A lot of people who spent a lot of amount in fee, right? Be it national education, national law universities where people spend something like 10, 12 lakh rupees. Then those people are more inclined to join law firms or corporate law, or they take up jobs in companies as in-house counsels rather than doing litigation, even though they might be more inclined to do litigation, but they don't do that. Why? Because they have to pay back loans.
Definitely. And then they wait for that period of payment of the loan to actually
Yeah,
pursue their interest. So those are
yeah.
some of the realities. But with that, the questions for today have ended. But I would like to thank you, Prashant, for taking out your time and speaking to us so eloquently on the Street Vendors Act 2014, and also the rickshaw pullers and their issues, as well as the wins that you have had in the Supreme Court regarding those issues. It was really intriguing, it was interesting, it was informative, what all we got to hear today, and it was an educative experience. My thoughts for you are that I did know you back in law school, and you have always been this person who has been interested in social interest, and I myself have been interested in that, running the legal aid clinic at Jindal from the very first year of my law school experience. And I've always seen you as a person who is working and using his knowledge of law for social interest, for public interest lawyering to an extent, although you might not actively go and file these cases, but the idea is that your research speaks volumes of it. So I see you as a champion for social justice, and it's great to have you as an alumnus of Jindal Global Law School, OP Jindal Global University. We're certainly proud of you, and we hope that people in the legal community, not only in Jindal but elsewhere, also understand that bright, sharp, interesting, smart people like you have entered this field, and this is something that is coming from your own inner self, that this is what you wanted to do, and that passion really resonates in your talks, as well as the fact that you have been at it for so many years. So we wish you luck for the future, and we want you to keep coming back and sharing the gamut of knowledge and experience that you gain over the years with the legal community at large, because we would love to hear your perspectives going forward as well. With that, I thank you, Prashant, for being here today, and to the attendees, thank you for being so patient and for your wonderful questions. And we'll meet next week again. Closing remarks, Prashant.
Thank you so much, Shireen. Thanks for having me here. It was great to be back sort of at Jindal and doing a webinar under the Jindal banner. I wish I could come in person to the university campus and do this there in front of the students. I really miss the campus and hope to be there soon. Yeah.
Hopefully, once the situation is more normalized and we are able to get back to our normal lives or the new normal, I would personally extend an invite to you to come and speak to
Sure.
the students at Jindal. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
and have
Thank
a
you.
nice day ahead.